When Germany lost World War II, the National Socialist Party became an organization persecuted by international justice, in addition to which German officers and generals were arrested and tried as war criminals. Although most of the main figures who accompanied Adolf Hitler in his crusade against all races that he believed to be inferior were executed in Nuremberg, others had to face Allied tribunals, which were established in occupied countries such as Italy or France. Among them, three personalities stand out who were fundamental to the functioning of the Nazi armed forces: Gotthard Heinrichsai, Hermann Hoth, and Albert Kesselring. Each of these men represented, in their own way, a necessary gear for the advancement of the relentless extermination machinery that was Nazi Germany, especially in command of large contingents of the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe. Join us in a new episode of Military History to learn about the fate of these sinister characters after the fall of Nazism. We'll start by talking about one of the most controversial figures within the German army. Gotthard Heinrichsai was one of Adolf Hitler's most esteemed strategists, and in his role as general of the Wehrmacht he achieved an enormous number of victories on both the eastern and western fronts. His own men nicknamed him the Venomous Dwarf, due to his small stature, which contrasted with his relentless tenacity in destroying his enemies. Heinrichsai's tactics typically featured using the resources at his disposal in an extremely optimal and efficient way to break down the defenses that opposed his path. Gotthard was one of the protagonists of the beginning of the Second World War, when in 1940 he participated in the Blitzkriegs of France. He was also one of the few generals who was not humiliated in the invasion attempts against the Soviet Union. In many cases, Heinrichsai's forces were outnumbered by Red Army battalions 10 times their size, yet the Nazi general still managed to hold his lines. It was around this time, during 1941, that he developed a movement of his own, which involved withdrawing his lines of gunners as the enemy artillery advanced in order to redeploy the guns and mortars before the Soviet infantry reached his men. This tactic surprised large contingents of the Red Army more than once, as well as allowing Heinrichsai and his men to hold out long enough to escape the harsh backlash that Stalin's soldiers launched after breaking out of the encirclement of Stalingrad. Despite his effectiveness, Heinrichsai was not always faithful to the Führer. In fact, during the last weeks of the war he was in charge of the defense of Berlin, and he opposed one of the main directives that Hitler had given. The Nero Order, also known as the Scorched Earth Policy, required all Nazi soldiers and officers to destroy military or civilian buildings so that they would not fall into Allied hands. Heinrichsai considered this insane, and as a general in charge of protecting major German cities, he forbade all of his subordinates from intentionally destroying German property. He also adamantly refused the order to shoot any soldier who backed down from the Soviets, and invited his superior, Marshal Keitel, to take up arms himself to assassinate the young men defending Berlin. Everything indicates that, unlike the National Socialist leadership, Heinrichsai saw a future beyond that particular war. However, his rebellion led the Nazi Party itself to try to assassinate him after he was relieved of his position and invited to an alleged informal meeting. Thanks to a friend of his, he found out that this was an ambush to assassinate him. He was captured after the end of the war by the Allies, and spent 3 years in a detention camp in Wales. In 1948 he was released, and during the 1950s he was part of the Corps of War Veterans of the United States Army, within an office that recruited former Nazi officers to develop studies on military strategy, among other knowledge of war. Finally, he passed away in 1971, in freedom. Many of his letters, as well as thoughts recorded in a diary, were published in various volumes on ethical and moral conduct on the battlefield. Now it is time to talk about Albert Kesselring, one of the most morally criticized figures within the ranks of the Luftwaffe. As Field Marshal, he led the German Air Force in all the major campaigns of World War II, but he is remembered not only for his triumphs, but even more so for the terrible bombings against civilians, women and children he ordered. The war crimes attributed to Kesselring are hundreds. London, Warsaw, Rotterdam and other cities in Europe were completely devastated by the Luftflotte of the questioned Marshal. He is also questioned for the thousands of acts of abuse perpetrated by his troops in occupied countries, especially in Italy, where they not only harassed the general population, but also carried out the brutal massacre of the Fosse Ardeatine, where they murdered 335 Italians. After the war, Kesselring was judged harshly by a British court in 1947. The Marshal defended himself by claiming that within the campaigns he led, his intention was never to direct the fire of the bombs towards civilian areas, and that this happened accidentally. Since he could not prove this, he was ultimately sentenced to death. But he did not get to see the firing squad, as in 1948 the verdict was changed to life imprisonment, although he spent only 5 years in prison. Upon his release in 1952, he returned to Germany, where he lived with his wife. He was also elected president of the Afrika Korps Veterans Organization, as well as the Luftwaffe Veterans Corps. As a politician, he became a strong advocate for European military unity to establish defenses against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In addition to his political activism, he wrote 2 books about his personal experiences, the first called A Soldier Until the Last Day, and the second, Thoughts on World War II. He passed away in 1960, due to throat cancer. Finally, it is the turn of Hermann Hoth, one of the great leaders of the panzer divisions that terrorized Europe and allowed the rapid expansion of Hitler's Germany. Although he led a series of resoundingly successful offensives early in the war, he was one of the soldiers who failed to rescue the German Sixth Army, which had been trapped in Stalingrad. He later suffered another defeat, when he was forced back against the Soviets at Kursk, for which he was relieved of his duties and sent to the Führer's personal reserve. After being captured in 1945, he was tried in Nuremberg, but not within the body that faced the greatest leaders of the National Socialist Party but in a series of subsequent tribunals directed by the United States to try high-ranking military men who did not belong to the Nazi Dome. In the last of these trials, 13 generals were convicted, including Hermann Hoth. In 1948, he was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, having transmitted the order to put an end to the Jewish Bolshevik resistance in different occupied cities, which led to the torture, shooting and massacre of large contingents of civilians suspected of belonging to one of these 2 groups. Although he received a 15-year prison sentence, he only served 6, and was released at the height of the Cold War. For almost 2 decades, he achieved considerable renown as a military historian and strategic theorist, until he died in 1971, at the age of 85. Thank you very much for joining us in a new episode of Military History. Stay tuned for our next video.